Old man helped a blind tribal child find her way. The next day, masked warriors stood at his gate. The sun hadn't yet kissed the horizon when Ezekiel Thorne heard the war drums echoing across the canyon. 23 rhythmic beats, then silence. 23 beats again. His weathered hands trembled as he set down his morning coffee, the bitter liquid suddenly tasting like ash in his mouth. In all his 67 years on this unforgiving frontier, he had never heard that particular pattern. But he knew what it meant. They were coming for him. The adobe walls of his modest homestead seemed thinner than paper as those drums continued their ominous countdown. Through the single window facing east, he could see dust clouds rising in the distance, moving with purpose across the Badlands toward his isolated ranch. His mind raced back to yesterday evening, to the moment that had changed everything. Ezekiel had been returning from town with supplies when he spotted her stumbling through the mesquite brush near Devil's Ridge. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her long black hair tangled with thorns, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. She wore traditional Apache clothing, intricate beadwork catching the dying sunlight, but her eyes held that unmistakable milky cloudiness that spoke of blindness. She was calling out in her native tongue, words he couldn't understand but didn't need to. Terror and desperation sound the same in any language. Without hesitation, he had climbed down from his wagon and approached slowly, speaking in the few Apache words he knew from his trading days. The girl had initially recoiled, but hunger and exhaustion quickly overcame her fear. Her name was Ayanna, which she managed to convey through broken English mixed with hand gestures. She had become separated from her family during what seemed to be some kind of ceremonial journey. The details were unclear, but her desperation was not. She needed to return to her people before the moon changed, or something terrible would happen. The way she spoke of it, with such grave certainty despite her young age, sent chills down Ezekiel's spine. He had fed her dried beef and water, then carefully helped her into his wagon. Using landmarks she could identify through sound and smell, they had traveled for hours through increasingly treacherous terrain. The child possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate despite her blindness, directing him through narrow canyon passages he had never known existed. As night fell, they finally reached what appeared to be a sacred gathering place hidden deep within the Mesa country. Dozens of Apache warriors and families had assembled around multiple fires, their faces painted with symbols Ezekiel didn't recognize. The moment they saw him approaching with Ayanna, a profound silence fell over the entire gathering. An elderly medicine man with silver hair braided with eagle feathers had stepped forward. His eyes, sharp as obsidian, studied Ezekiel with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul. Through broken English and gestures, the old man had explained that Ayanna was no ordinary child. She was their tribe's most gifted spiritual guide, born with the ability to see beyond the physical world. Her blindness was considered a blessing that allowed her to perceive truths hidden from normal sight. The ceremony she had been traveling to was crucial for the tribe's survival. Without her participation, they believed their people would face a harsh winter that could destroy their way of life forever. Ezekiel had unknowingly helped preserve not just one child's life, but potentially the future of an entire community. The medicine man had offered him gifts, beautiful blankets and turquoise jewelry that would have been worth a fortune in any frontier town. But Ezekiel had politely declined, explaining that he required no payment for doing what any decent person should do. He had simply tipped his worn hat, wished them well, and begun the long journey back to his homestead. That had been yesterday. Now, as those war drums continued their relentless beating, Ezekiel realized his act of kindness had somehow been misinterpreted or had triggered consequences he couldn't have anticipated. Through his window, he could now make out individual figures on horseback, at least 30 of them, moving in perfect formation across the desert floor. Their faces were painted with black and red war paint, and they carried traditional weapons alongside more modern rifles. These weren't the same Apache who had greeted him with gratitude the night before. These warriors rode with the purpose of men seeking justice or revenge. Ezekiel's mind raced through possibilities. Had he violated some sacred taboo by entering the ceremonial grounds? Had his presence somehow contaminated or disrupted their ritual? Or was this about something else entirely, some old grudge or misunderstanding from his trading days that had finally caught up with him? His hands moved instinctively to the Winchester rifle mounted above his fireplace, but he hesitated. 30 against 1 were impossible odds, and besides, he had no desire to shed blood over what might be a simple misunderstanding. These were the same people whose child he had helped just hours before. There had to be another explanation. The riders were close enough now that he could hear their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth. Dust clouds obscured the morning sun, casting an orange-red hue over everything, making the approaching warriors look like harbingers from another world. The war drums had stopped, replaced by an even more ominous silence that made Ezekiel's heart pound against his ribs. He stepped outside onto his wooden porch, his hands deliberately empty and visible. The morning air carried the scent of sage and desert flowers, a peaceful contrast to the tension crackling in the atmosphere. His cattle had sensed the approaching danger and moved to the far end of his property, huddling together near the stream that provided his water supply. The lead warrior rode a magnificent paint horse, its black and white markings as striking as the man's war paint. This was clearly a chief or war leader, someone who commanded absolute respect from the others. He raised his hand, and the entire group came to a synchronized halt just beyond rifle range from Ezekiel's homestead. For several long moments, neither side moved. The only sounds were the occasional snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Ezekiel could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His mouth felt dry as leather, but he forced himself to remain calm and still. The war leader finally urged his horse forward, stopping just 20 feet from the porch. Up close, Ezekiel could see that this was a younger man, perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes that burned with barely controlled fury. Scars crisscrossed his chest and arms, telling stories of battles survived and victories won. This was not someone to be underestimated. When the warrior spoke, his English was precise and clear, with only the slightest accent. "You are Ezekiel Thorne." It wasn't a question. Ezekiel nodded slowly, maintaining eye contact despite every instinct telling him to look away. "I am. You helped the sacred child return to us yesterday." Again, Ezekiel nodded. Yes, she was lost and frightened. Any decent man would have done the same. The warrior's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been surprise or respect. "I am Dakota, war leader of the Chiricahua people. The child you helped is my daughter." Ezekiel felt his breath catch in his throat. "Ayana's father." That explained the intensity of emotion radiating from the man, but not necessarily the hostile approach with 30 armed warriors. "Your daughter is a remarkable girl," Ezekiel said carefully. "Brave and intelligent. You should be proud." "I am proud," Dakota replied, his voice carrying undertones that Ezekiel couldn't quite decipher. "But pride does not explain why a white man would risk his life to enter our most sacred grounds uninvited. I was simply returning your daughter to her people. I meant no disrespect." Dakota studied him for another long moment, then made a subtle gesture to his warriors. They remained mounted but visibly relaxed, though their weapons stayed within easy reach. "There are white men in our territory who would have sold my daughter to the Indian agents for bounty money. There are others who would have done far worse things to a helpless child. You chose a different path." Ezekiel sensed this conversation was heading somewhere important, but he couldn't predict where. There was no choice to make. "She needed help, so I helped her." "There is always a choice," Dakota replied, "and choices have consequences." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ezekiel waited, knowing that whatever came next would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. Dakota reached into a leather pouch hanging from his saddle and withdrew something wrapped in soft deer skin. He urged his horse closer to the porch and extended the bundle toward Ezekiel. "My daughter saw something in you yesterday, something that her gift of sight revealed. She told our medicine man that the Spirit spoke to her about you, that your act of kindness was not random, but part of a larger pattern that would soon become clear." Ezekiel accepted the bundle, surprised by its weight. When he unwrapped the deerskin, he found a stunning piece of silver jewelry, a pendant in the shape of a thunderbird with turquoise inlays that seemed to glow with their own internal light. "This belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him. It is said to protect the wearer from evil spirits and guide them through times of great danger. I cannot accept such a valuable gift," Ezekiel began, but Dakota raised a hand to stop him. "It is not a gift. It is payment for a debt that has not yet come due." Before Ezekiel could ask what that meant, the sound of approaching horses came from the opposite direction. Both men turned to see a cloud of dust rising from the main trail leading to town. Even at this distance, they could make out at least a dozen riders moving at a hard gallop toward the homestead. Dakota's expression darkened as he studied the approaching figures through a small spyglass. "Cavalry patrol," he said grimly, "led by Captain Morrison." Ezekiel's blood turned to ice at the mention of that name. Captain James Morrison was known throughout the territory as an Indian fighter who believed the only good Apache was a dead Apache. He had gained notoriety for his brutal tactics and his complete disregard for treaties or peaceful solutions to conflicts. "They're coming for you," Ezekiel realized. "Perhaps," Dakota replied, "or perhaps they're coming for you." The implications of that statement hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. If the cavalry found him here with 30 Apache warriors, they would assume he was either a prisoner or a traitor collaborating with hostile Indians. Either way, the result would likely be violence that would leave many people dead. "You need to leave," Ezekiel said urgently. "Now before they get close enough to see you clearly." Dakota shook his head. "Running would only confirm their suspicions and make them pursue us into the mountains where they could threaten our entire tribe. Sometimes the best defense is to stand and face the storm. They'll kill you all. Perhaps. But my daughter's vision suggested that today would bring a test that would determine the fate of both our peoples in this valley. She said that a white man with courage in his heart would stand between war and peace when the moment came." Ezekiel looked down at the Thunderbird pendant in his hands, its turquoise eyes seeming to stare directly into his soul. The approaching cavalry was close enough now that he could make out individual riders and see the dust being kicked up by their horses' hooves. Captain Morrison rode at the front of the formation, his blue uniform already stained with sweat and desert dust. Even from a distance, Ezekiel could see the man's hand resting on his sidearm, ready for trouble. Behind him rode a mixed group of regular soldiers and civilian volunteers, the kind of men who saw Apache hunting as sport rather than duty. "What exactly did your daughter see in her vision?" Ezekiel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Dakota's expression grew grave. "She saw fire and blood covering this valley. She saw women and children weeping over the bodies of their fathers and husbands. She saw the end of our people's time in this land, and she saw a way to prevent it. She saw a choice. One man standing between two forces, with the power to speak words that could either ignite a war or plant the seeds of understanding." The Thunderbird pendant felt heavier in Ezekiel's hands as the full weight of responsibilities settled on his shoulders. In less than 5 minutes, Captain Morrison and his men would arrive at his homestead to find him surrounded by Apache warriors. What happened next would depend entirely on the words he chose to speak and the courage he could summon in that crucial moment. Dakota wheeled his horse around to face his warriors and spoke rapidly in Apache. The men immediately began arranging themselves in a defensive formation, but not one that appeared aggressive to approaching observers. They looked more like an escort than a war party, though Ezekiel doubted that distinction would matter to Captain Morrison. The cavalry patrol was close enough now that Ezekiel could see the individual faces of the soldiers. Morrison himself was a tall, lean man with cold gray eyes and a mustache that failed to soften his harsh features. He had the look of someone who had spent years fighting on the frontier and had lost whatever capacity for mercy he might once have possessed. "Remember," Dakota said quietly, "your words in the next few minutes will echo through generations yet unborn." Ezekiel slipped the Thunderbird pendant over his head, feeling its weight settle against his chest. The turquoise seemed to pulse with warmth, as if responding to his elevated heartbeat. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the courage that Ayana's vision had apparently seen in him. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as Captain Morrison's patrol approached the final bend in the trail. In moments, they would crest the small rise that would give them a clear view of the homestead and the gathering of Apache warriors. Ezekiel stepped down from his porch and walked slowly toward the middle of the yard, positioning himself between the two forces. Behind him, Dakota and his warriors sat motionless on their horses, 30 pairs of dark eyes watching and waiting. Ahead, the dust cloud marking the cavalry's approach grew larger and more ominous with each passing second. And in the center of it all stood one aging rancher with nothing but his words and whatever wisdom he could summon to prevent a massacre. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the desert landscape and heating the air until it shimmered like water above the sand. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice carrying across the emptiness like an omen of things to come. Ezekiel took a deep breath and waited for Captain Morrison to arrive. The first horse crested the ridge at exactly 8:30 in the morning, silhouetted against the pale sky like a dark omen. Captain Morrison sat ramrod straight in his saddle, his weathered face scanning the scene before him with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. His hand never moved from his pistol grip as he took in the sight of 30 Apache warriors arranged in perfect formation around the modest homestead. Behind Morrison, his men spread out in a loose line, their rifles already unslung and ready for action. These weren't green recruits fresh from back east. These were frontier veterans, men who had learned to shoot first and ask questions later in a land where hesitation often meant death. Their faces showed the hard lines and suspicious eyes that came from too many ambushes and too many friends buried in unmarked graves. Sergeant Riley, a thick-set Irishman with graying temples, rode at Morrison's right flank. His voice carried clearly across the desert air as he called out a warning to his men. "Easy, boys. Keep your weapons ready, but don't make any sudden moves until the captain gives the word." Morrison raised his hand, bringing the patrol to a halt just 50 yards from where Ezekiel stood. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as 30 Apache warriors faced off against 12 cavalry soldiers, with one aging rancher caught directly in the middle. "Well, well," Morrison said, his voice dripping with contempt as he surveyed the scene. "Ezekiel Thorne, I might have known we'd find you consorting with hostiles when decent folks started reporting war parties in the area." Ezekiel kept his voice level and calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Good morning, Captain Morrison. These men aren't hostiles. They came here peacefully to speak with me about a personal matter." Morrison's laugh was as cold and harsh as winter wind through canyon walls. "Personal matter? 30 painted warriors armed for battle, and you call it personal?" He leaned forward in his saddle, his gray eyes boring into Ezekiel's face. "What I see here looks a lot like an old Indian trader who's forgotten which side of the color line he belongs on." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Several of the Apache warriors shifted restlessly at the hostile tone, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Dakota himself remained perfectly still, but Ezekiel could see the muscles in his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. "I've never forgotten anything about who I am or where my loyalties lie," Ezekiel replied quietly. "I'm an American citizen living peacefully on land I bought and paid for. These men came here under a flag of truce to return something I lost yesterday. Flag of truce? Morrison's voice rose with incredulous anger. I don't see any white flag, Thorne. What I see are war-painted savages who've been raiding settlements up and down this valley for the past month. That's not true, Ezekiel said firmly. Dakota and his people had nothing to do with those raids. Dakota? Morrison's eyes narrowed dangerously as he focused on the Apache war leader. So you know this buck by name, do you? That tells me everything I need to know about whose side you're really on. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ezekiel could see fingers tightening on triggers and hands moving toward knife handles. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and this desert morning would explode into violence that would leave the ground soaked with blood from both sides. Behind Morrison, Private Jenkins, a nervous young man barely out of his teens, was sweating heavily despite the morning coolness. His rifle barrel wavered slightly as he tried to keep multiple targets in sight simultaneously. To his left, Corporal Martinez kept glancing between the Apache warriors and his captain, clearly wondering if they were about to ride into a massacre. Captain, Sergeant Riley said quietly, maybe we should hear what the man has to say before we start making assumptions. Morrison's head snapped toward his sergeant with fury blazing in his eyes. I don't recall asking for your opinion, Sergeant. When I want tactical advice from someone who's never commanded anything bigger than a latrine detail, I'll be sure to let you know. Riley's face flushed red, but years of military discipline kept him silent. The public humiliation was just another example of Morrison's leadership style, ruling through fear and intimidation rather than respect and competence. Dakota chose that moment to urge his horse forward, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering a violent response from the jumpy soldiers. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Captain Morrison, I know your reputation as a soldier. Your name is spoken around our fires, though not always with admiration. Morrison's hand moved to his pistol grip, his face darkening with rage. I don't give a damn what you savages say around your fires. The only thing that matters is that you're trespassing on white man's land, and that gives me all the authority I need to deal with you permanently. This land belongs to Ezekiel Thorne, Dakota replied calmly. We are here at his invitation, conducting peaceful business. We have broken no laws and threatened no one. Your very existence is a threat, Morrison snarled. Every day you draw breath is another day some innocent settler's family has to sleep with loaded guns by their beds. The hatred in Morrison's voice was visceral and absolute, the kind of deep-seated prejudice that no amount of reasoning could penetrate. Ezekiel realized that the captain had already made up his mind about how this confrontation was going to end, regardless of what anyone said or did. But Dakota seemed determined to try diplomacy one more time. Yesterday, this man helped my daughter return safely to our people when she was lost and frightened. Today, I came to thank him and to honor the debt my family owes him. There is no shame in showing gratitude to those who show kindness to our children. Your daughter? Morrison's expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in his armor of absolute hostility. What daughter? Dakota reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small item wrapped in soft buckskin. When he unwrapped it, the morning sunlight caught the intricate beadwork of a child's moccasin, obviously made with great care and love. My daughter Ayana became separated from our group during a ceremony in the sacred places. She is blind and could not find her way home alone. This man found her and brought her back to us safely, asking for nothing in return. Morrison studied the tiny moccasin, and for just a moment, something almost human flickered in his cold gray eyes. Ezekiel seized on that momentary crack in the captain's hostile facade. She's just a little girl, Captain. 8 years old, blind since birth, scared and lost in the desert. What would you have done if you'd found her? Morrison's jaw worked silently for several seconds before he found his voice again. That's different. That's not the same thing at all. How is it different? Ezekiel pressed gently. A child is a child, regardless of the color of her skin or the language she speaks. Any decent person would have helped her. Because they're not like us. Morrison exploded, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking completely. They're not civilized. They're not Christian. They're barely even human. The words echoed across the desert like gunshots, hanging in the superheated air with their naked ugliness fully exposed. Several of the Apache warriors made angry sounds deep in their throats, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. The cavalry soldiers tensed in response, creating a feedback loop of escalating hostility that threatened to spiral completely out of control. But Dakota remained perfectly calm, his dark eyes studying Morrison with something that might have been pity. "You speak of civilization and Christianity, Captain. Tell me, what do your holy books teach about showing mercy to children? What does your civilization say about protecting the innocent and helpless?" Morrison's face turned an alarming shade of red as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make him sound like a complete hypocrite. "Don't you dare quote scripture at me, you heathen. Don't you dare try to twist the word of God to justify your savage ways." "I twist nothing," Dakota replied quietly. "I simply ask what your God would say about a man who shows hatred toward those who show kindness to lost children." The question hit Morrison like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. Around him, his own soldiers were beginning to shift uncomfortably as they processed the moral implications of what their captain was advocating. Sergeant Riley cleared his throat nervously. "Captain, if the man really did help a lost child, well, that doesn't sound like something we should be punishing him for." Morrison whirled on his sergeant with fury blazing in his eyes. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant?" "No, sir. I just think maybe we should consider all the facts before we decide what action to take. The only fact that matters is that we have 30 armed hostiles on American soil, and it's our job to deal with them according to military protocol." "What protocol would that be, exactly?" Ezekiel asked quietly. "The protocol that says you should attack peaceful men who came here to thank someone for helping their children." Morrison's hand moved to his pistol, his patience finally exhausted completely. "The protocol that says I don't have to stand here listening to Indian-loving traitors lecture me about my duty to this territory and the people I've sworn to protect." The morning air seemed to vibrate with tension as Morrison slowly drew his sidearm, not pointing it directly at anyone but making his intentions crystal clear. Behind him, his soldiers raised their rifles with the mechanical precision of men who had performed this action too many times before. In response, the Apache warriors readied their own weapons, creating a deadly tableau where the slightest wrong move would trigger a bloodbath that would echo through the history of the territory for generations to come. Ezekiel found himself thinking about little Ayanna, about her remarkable ability to navigate through darkness using senses that most people never developed. In a way, everyone gathered here this morning was blind, stumbling through darkness of prejudice and hatred that prevented them from seeing the humanity in each other. The Thunderbird pendant around his neck seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him of the child's vision and the terrible responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. According to Dakota, his daughter had foreseen this moment and believed that one man's words could determine whether it ended in tragedy or hope. "Captain Morrison," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying clearly across the tense silence, "I want to tell you a story about what happened yesterday, and I want you to listen to every word before you decide what kind of man you want to be remembered as." Morrison's finger tightened on his pistol trigger, but something in Ezekiel's tone made him hesitate. "I was coming back from town with supplies when I heard a child crying in the brush near Devil's Ridge. When I found her, she was scratched and bleeding, terrified and alone. She couldn't see where she was going, couldn't find her way home, couldn't even call for help in a language anyone around here would understand." Ezekiel paused, letting the image sink in. "Now, I've got a choice to make in that moment. I can drive on past, tell myself it's not my problem, let someone else deal with it. Or I can stop and help a frightened child find her way back to the people who love her." Morrison's weapon wavered slightly, but he didn't lower it. "The choice I made says something about who I am as a man and as a human being. Just like the choice you make right now is going to say something about who you are, Captain." The desert morning had grown completely still, as if the entire landscape was holding its breath, waiting to see how this confrontation would resolve itself. Even the wind had died away, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the distant cry of a circling hawk. "You can pull that trigger and start a fight that will leave good men dead on both sides," Ezekiel continued. "You can write a report that makes you sound like a hero for slaughtering peaceful men who came here to show gratitude. But you'll know the truth, and so will every soldier under your command." Several of Morrison's men were now looking distinctly uncomfortable, shifting in their saddles and avoiding eye contact with their captain. The moral clarity of the situation was becoming harder and harder to ignore. "Or," Ezekiel said softly, "you can be the kind of man who recognizes honor and decency when he sees it, regardless of what color skin it's wrapped in. You can be the kind of leader who makes decisions based on facts rather than prejudice." Morrison's hand was trembling now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning coolness. Around him, the desert seemed to pulse with potential energy, like a thunderstorm gathering strength before the lightning strikes. The moment stretched out like an eternity, balanced on the edge of a knife blade, waiting for one man's decision to tip it toward violence or peace. In that crystalline instant, Ezekiel understood exactly what Ayana's vision had shown her. This wasn't really about Apache raiders or cavalry patrols or even lost children. This was about the fundamental choice between hatred and understanding, between fear and courage, between the kind of future they wanted to build in this harsh but beautiful land. The Thunderbird pendant felt warm against his chest as he waited to see which way the scales would finally tip. The silence stretched on like a taut wire ready to snap. Captain Morrison's pistol remained half raised, his gray eyes darting between Ezekiel and the Apache warriors behind him. The internal struggle playing out on his weathered face was visible to everyone present. Years of military conditioning and frontier prejudice warred against the uncomfortable truth of what he was being asked to do. Sergeant Riley shifted in his saddle, his own rifle lowered but ready. The older soldier had seen enough unnecessary bloodshed in his 20 years of service to recognize the difference between necessary action and senseless slaughter. His voice, when he finally spoke, was carefully neutral but carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Captain, with respect, these men don't appear to be in any kind of attack formation. They're just sitting there waiting to see what we do." Morrison's head snapped toward his sergeant, his face flushing with renewed anger. "I didn't ask for tactical analysis, Sergeant. When I want your opinion, I'll request it through proper channels." But the damage was already done. Rayleigh's observation had given the other soldiers permission to think critically about what they were seeing rather than simply following orders without question. Private Jenkins lowered his rifle slightly, his young face creased with uncertainty. Corporal Martinez glanced nervously between his commanding officer and the peaceful gathering of Apache warriors. Dakota chose that moment to dismount from his horse, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid triggering a violent response. His hands remained clearly visible as he walked toward the center of the clearing, stopping just 10 feet from where Ezekiel stood. "Captain Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I am going to tell you something that may be difficult for you to hear, but it needs to be said." Morrison's pistol swung toward Dakota, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Don't move another step, Savage. I'm warning you." But Dakota didn't stop. Instead, he reached into his shirt and withdrew something that made every person present catch their breath. It was a small photograph, creased and worn from handling, showing a young Apache girl standing beside an older white woman in front of a mission school. "This is my daughter Ayana when she was 6 years old, standing with Sister Margaret at the mission school in Santa Fe. For 2 years, I allowed her to live among your people, to learn your language and your customs, because I believed that understanding between our peoples was possible. Morrison's weapon wavered as he stared at the photograph. The image of a smiling Apache child standing peacefully beside a Catholic nun didn't fit with his worldview of savage hostiles who needed to be eliminated. Sister Margaret wrote letters telling me how bright Ayana was, how quickly she learned to read despite her blindness, how she helped the other children with their lessons. She said my daughter had a gift for bringing people together, for helping them see past their differences to the humanity they shared. Takota's voice grew stronger as he continued, though pain flickered in his dark eyes. But then the new territorial governor issued orders that all Indian children had to be removed from their families permanently. They said we were unfit parents, that our culture was poison that needed to be eliminated. They said my daughter would never be allowed to return home. The photograph trembled slightly in Takota's weathered hands as old grief surfaced, so I took her back. I rode to that mission school with 10 of my best warriors, and I took my daughter home where she belonged. Sister Margaret wept when we left. She begged me to reconsider, said that Ayana would have opportunities with the white world that she could never have with our people. Morrison's pistol had dropped several inches as he listened, though his finger remained on the trigger. But I knew something Sister Margaret didn't understand. My daughter's blindness isn't a disability to be cured or hidden away. Among our people, it's recognized as a sacred gift. She can see things that others cannot, understand truths that are invisible to normal sight. Yesterday, when she returned from being lost, she told me she had seen visions of this moment. Ezekiel felt the Thunderbird pendant grow warm against his chest as Takota continued. She saw a white man with courage in his heart standing between two forces that could destroy each other. She saw words being spoken that would either plant seeds of understanding or water the ground with blood. She saw you, Captain Morrison, making a choice that would echo through generations of both our peoples. Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. The absolute certainty in Takota's voice was unsettling, especially given how accurately the girl seemed to have predicted the current situation. That's impossible. She's just a child, and a blind one at that. She couldn't have known we would be here today. Could she have known that you would come here with exactly 12 men? Could she have known that you would be wearing a silver cross on a chain around your neck, hidden beneath your uniform shirt? Morrison's free hand moved instinctively to his throat, where a thin silver chain was barely visible above his collar. The cross had been his mother's, worn every day since her death 5 years earlier. No one in the territory knew about it except his personal physician, who had seen it during medical examinations. "Lucky guess," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could she have known that you lost your own daughter to fever 3 winters ago? Could she have known that her name was Sarah and that she would have been 11 years old this summer?" The color drained completely from Morrison's face as if he had been struck by lightning. Sarah's death had been the most closely guarded secret of his personal life, something he had shared with no one in the territory. The grief had hardened him, turned whatever compassion he might once have possessed into bitter hatred for a world that could take innocent children, while leaving evil men alive to cause more suffering. How could she possibly know that? He whispered. Takota's expression softened with something that might have been understanding. Because she sees beyond the surface of things, beyond the anger and hatred you wear like armor. She sees the broken father who never properly grieved for his lost child. She sees the pain that drives you to seek revenge against a world that took away the most precious thing in your life. Morrison's pistol hand was shaking violently now, the weapon wavering between Takota and the ground as decades of suppressed grief threatened to overwhelm him. She also saw something else, Takota continued gently. She saw that your daughter Sarah is not truly gone. The love you carry for her, the memories you cherish, the lessons she taught you about joy and innocence, these things live on in your heart. They can still guide you toward being the kind of man she would have wanted you to be. Tears were streaming down Morrison's weathered cheeks now. his carefully constructed facade of military discipline crumbling like a dam bursting under too much pressure. Behind him, his soldiers watched in stunned silence as their hard-as-nails commanding officer broke down completely. "She was everything good in this world," Morrison said through his tears. "She was kind and gentle, and she saw beauty in everything, even the things that adults had learned to fear or hate. When she died, it felt like all the light went out of the world." "I understand that pain," Dakota replied softly. "Every father who has ever loved a daughter understands that kind of fear. The thought of losing Ayanna, of never seeing her smile or hearing her laugh again, it terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced in battle." Morrison looked up at Dakota with red-rimmed eyes, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "How do you bear it? How do you function knowing that everything you love could be taken away at any moment?" "By choosing love over fear, even when fear seems like the safer choice. By teaching my daughter that the world is full of both darkness and light, and that we have the power to decide which one grows stronger." Morrison's pistol finally dropped to his side as the full weight of his choices settled on his shoulders. Around him, the desert morning had taken on an almost sacred quality, as if the land itself was witnessing a moment of profound transformation. Sergeant Riley cleared his throat quietly. "Captain, what are your orders?" Morrison looked around at the circle of faces watching him, Apache and white alike, all waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be in this crucial moment. The decision he made here would ripple outward through the territory, affecting countless lives for years to come. "Stand down," he said quietly. "Lower your weapons and stand down." The relief among the soldiers was palpable as rifles were lowered and tensions began to ease. But Morrison wasn't finished yet. "Dakota, I owe you an apology. I came here ready to start a war based on assumptions and prejudices that I should have questioned long ago." Dakota nodded gravely. "Apologies are meaningful only when they lead to changed behavior. The question now is what we do with this moment of understanding." Morrison holstered his pistol and dismounted from his horse, walking slowly toward where Dakota stood. When he reached the Apache war leader, he extended his hand in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just minutes earlier. "I propose we start with mutual respect and see where that leads us." Dakota grasped Morrison's hand firmly, and Ezekiel felt the Thunderbird pendant pulse with warmth against his chest. In that simple handshake between former enemies, something profound had shifted in the spiritual landscape of the territory. "There's something else," Morrison said, his voice still rough with emotion. "Those raids that have been happening up and down the valley, the ones I assumed your people were responsible for. If it wasn't you, then who was it?" Dakota's expression darkened. "White men dressed as Apache, led by a man with a scar across his left cheek and a tattoo of a snake on his forearm. They attack settlements and leave behind evidence pointing to our people. Someone wants a war between us badly enough to orchestrate these false attacks." Morrison's military training kicked in as he processed this information. Scar on the left cheek, snake tattoo on the forearm. That sounds like Jake Thornton and his gang of claim jumpers. But why would they want to start an Indian war? "Because war creates chaos," Ezekiel interjected, the pieces finally falling into place in his mind. "And chaos creates opportunities for men like Thornton to grab land and resources while everyone else is focused on survival." "Exactly," Dakota confirmed. "While soldiers and warriors are fighting each other, men like Thornton can steal cattle, claim mineral rights, and take over the best grazing land without anyone noticing until it's too late." Morrison's face hardened with renewed anger, but this time it was directed toward the real enemy. "How long has this been going on?" 3 months, Dakota replied. "We've been tracking their movements, trying to gather evidence of their deception, but every time we tried to approach white authorities, we were met with hostility and suspicion." "That ends today," Morrison said firmly. "From now on, any Apache representative who wants to speak with military authorities will be given safe passage and a fair hearing." "And in return," Dakota said, My people will share information about Thornton's activities and assist in bringing him to justice." The sun had climbed higher during their conversation, and the desert air was beginning to shimmer with heat waves. But the atmosphere among the gathered men had transformed completely. Where there had been suspicion and hatred just an hour earlier, there was now the beginning of mutual understanding and respect. Ahana's vision had come to pass exactly as she had foreseen. One man's choice to show courage in the face of hatred had indeed planted seeds that could grow into something beautiful, given time and careful tending. Morrison turned to address his soldiers. "Men, I want you to remember this morning. Remember that sometimes our enemies aren't who we think they are, and sometimes our assumptions can lead us down dark paths that we later regret. Real courage isn't about being quick to fight. It's about being slow to judge and wise enough to listen before we act." Sergeant Riley nodded approvingly. "Yes, sir. Should we send word back to the fort about the Thornton situation?" "Immediately. And I want patrols doubled in areas where his gang has been operating. It's time to put an end to his schemes once and for all." As the soldiers prepared to ride out, Dakota approached Ezekiel one final time. "My daughter was right about you," he said with a slight smile. "You have the gift of seeing people's hearts, even when they're hidden beneath layers of pain and anger." Ezekiel fingered the Thunderbird pendant around his neck. "I just tried to do what any decent person would do. That's exactly what makes you special. In a world where hatred often seems easier than understanding, you chose the harder path. That choice saved many lives today and will save many more in the days to come." Captain Morrison approached them, his uniform dusty and his face still showing traces of the emotional storm he had weathered. "Ezekiel, I owe you thanks as well. Your words helped me remember who I used to be before grief and anger consumed everything good in me." "We all lose our way sometimes," Ezekiel replied. "The important thing is finding the courage to change course when we realize we're headed down the wrong path." Morrison nodded, then turned to Dakota. "I'd like to meet your daughter someday, if that would be appropriate. I have a feeling there's a lot I could learn from her." "She would be honored," Dakota replied. "But I warn you, she has a gift for seeing straight through to people's souls. It can be an unsettling experience. After today, I think I'm ready for a little unsettling truth in my life." As the two groups prepared to go their separate ways, the desert morning felt different somehow. The air seemed cleaner, the sunshine warmer, the endless sky more hopeful. What had begun as a confrontation between enemies had transformed into the foundation of something that might, with time and patience, grow into genuine friendship. Dakota mounted his horse and raised his hand in farewell. "Until we meet again, may the spirits watch over you and keep you safe." Morrison returned the gesture, his own hand raised in respectful acknowledgement. "And may your paths be smooth and your water always sweet." As the Apache warriors rode away toward the distant mesas, and the cavalry patrol headed back toward their fort, Ezekiel stood alone in his yard watching the dust clouds settle. The Thunderbird pendant felt warm against his chest, a tangible reminder of the extraordinary events that had unfolded on this ordinary Tuesday morning. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily on thermal currents rising from the heated desert floor. Its cry echoed across the vastness, no longer sounding like an omen of doom but like a song of celebration. The land itself seemed to exhale with relief, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting to see whether it would be watered with blood or blessed with the possibility of peace. Ezekiel walked back toward his modest adobe house, already thinking about the letter he would write to the territorial governor describing the morning's events. It would be important to get the true story on record before rumor and speculation could distort what had really happened. But first, he had cattle to tend and a life to live. The same simple, honest existence he had been living before war drums echoed across the canyon and changed everything. The only difference now was that he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, in moments of crisis, ordinary people are called upon to do extraordinary things. And sometimes, if they have the courage to listen to their better angels, they rise to meet that calling and help bend the arc of history toward justice and understanding. The Thunderbird pendant caught the morning sunlight as he climbed the steps to his porch, its turquoise eyes seeming to wink with ancient wisdom. Somewhere in the sacred places beyond the mesa, a blind Apache girl was probably telling her family about the visions she had seen, about the white man with courage in his heart who had helped prevent a war. And in a cavalry fort several miles away, a grieving father was beginning to remember that love is stronger than hatred, and that the best way to honor a lost daughter is to protect other people's children, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. The morning was still young, and there was much work to be done. But for the first time in months, the future felt bright with possibility instead of dark with the shadow of inevitable conflict. In the end, that was Ayana's greatest gift, not the ability to see the future, but the wisdom to understand that the future is not fixed. It can be changed by the choices we make and the courage we show in crucial moments when everything hangs in the balance. The war drums had fallen silent, replaced by the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant laughter of children playing safely in their homes, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything they held dear. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.